Hello, 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 hello. Hello, and welcome to Loop. You're watching Loop TV. Loop, a shape produced by a curve that bends round, crosses itself, a structure, series, or a process, the end of which is connected to the beginning. Looping, to form something into a loop or loops, encircle or go round. Loopy, slang phrase for mad or irrational behavior, normally accompanied by gestures. Loophole, legal contractual means of escape. Loop the loop on the roller coaster. Loopers, a 2012 movie about time travel and altering history. Feedback loop. Perhaps this is what you're watching. No, you're watching Loop TV. My name is Harold Offeh, and tonight we present you a preview of the forthcoming exhibition Loop, which is due to open in the autumn of 2021. Loop is a group show featuring the artists Fredo, Adham Faramawy, Phoebe Collings-James, Keiken, and Samra, Mayanja. It's co-curated by Eastside Projects and me, Harold Offeh. Loop and Loop TV has been commissioned by Eastside Projects and Birmingham International Dance Festival. And the program is supported by Dance Exchange. One of the contributions you will see tonight is a conversation that I have with the artist Phoebe Collings-James. And in that conversation, we discuss a number of key topics related to Phoebe's ongoing research towards her installation, which will form part of the Loop exhibition in the autumn of 2021.
Cool. Do you want to go with a question first, or should I?
Well, I mean, I'm wondering if we could start with that question just about the work and the research and, you know, the project that you're developing for Loop. And I mean, I know that draws on ongoing research interests. So just as a way in.
Okay, cool. So I guess the three references that I've been thinking about are quite disparate in a way, but one of them is cabaret, and specifically the sort of iconic scene of in the cabaret, which sort of has this very like final hurrah kind of like brass band sound, especially towards the end of the scene. And then the other reference is a film called Our Song, which is got a young Kerry Washington in it, and it's about three girls. I think they're about 15 in America. And it's just a really sort of like young person sort of like story about their lives and the ins and outs and the different challenges they're facing at school. And they're also part of a brass band. And I guess that really resonated because it just really reminded me of like me and my friends at that age. It was sort of one of the first films I'd seen that sort of like really imaged that, even though it was like in a completely different place. And the sort of foundation of the film was this brass band they were all part of. And then at different moments when some sort of like bigger things are going on in some of their lives, some of them drop out. And it's, you know, it's really the foundation of the film. And then the other reference was sort of thinking about brass instruments and brass players in the UK, and kind of like the first time that kind of came into my consciousness, which would have been sort of like the Courtney Pine era, being taken to gigs and stuff, well, usually to festivals with my parents, and there always been like a jazz tent, and sort of like witnessing some of these sounds in there. And then also, I guess I would have been hearing it at home, and it was like very sort of like that neo soul-ish, is it neo soul? Yeah, that kind of like beginning era of that kind of sound. And then also sort of like hearing that specific sort of saxophone sound on like very like Channel 5 movies. And I guess sort of like these, maybe some of the ways in which this all intersects is that there's this sort of like, there's this one flow of sort of like eroticism, slightly like this sort of like young sexuality, sensuality, awareness of it through sound and through these like sort of saxophone instruments being kind of like signifiers of a certain time. Like I think some of the first sex I would have seen would have been sort of like in these like late night hours on like bad movies in Channel 4, where actually there was probably very little skin on show, but just for like 2 seconds there was like a glimpse of tit and bum or some leg or whatever, and it's like and yeah, and then but then I guess the other thing that that sort of goes through that is this is sort of in the film like Cabaret, where you've got this sort of very like tender and dangerous tension between this sort of exuberance and camp and sense of sort of like agency or finding agency amidst what was about to be a kind of extremely sort of like fatal time in like the Weimar Republic and in Germany. Yeah, so that kind of, yeah. And I guess what I'm interested in is how other people have dealt with this. So even within our song, what you don't fully see is probably the context of these are still 3 young Black girls living in America in, I guess, the early 90s, like becoming young people in the beginning of the early 90s, where they're like we know that they're like living in projects which are under like extreme like militarized sort of surveillance. They're living in precarity. Like, I guess I'm interested in our popular culture and in art, like how the nuance of agency is told, and like especially in relation to our embodiment through our like relationships and our sexuality and our erotic lives and our tender lives with other people and our families and friends. And yeah, so I guess like in thinking about all of these and thinking about sound and thinking about like brass instruments and this specific train of connections that I've had, that's where I've been.
I mean, there's something really interesting about the motif then of sound, music, and particularly brass, the kind of materiality of that sound as well, that sort of, you know, is in a way a feature of kind of cabaret, but also of, you know, the Courtney Pine kind of late 90s sort of jazz kind of sort of reference. I'm wondering, yeah, you know, is there a particular reason you're sort of drawn to the quality of that sound?
I wonder if it's because there is literally a vocality to it, like in a very maybe like obvious and quite basic bass way, that it kind of, it sounds like the voice, it sounds like some of the tones of the voice of expression. And maybe it sort of like happens in cartoons, or like people who do voice, you know, like voices for cartoons and stuff, and when sometimes they're like not actually even saying words that you understand, but there is like certain sounds, I think, whether it's like also like the variation from like a trumpet to a bass to a saxophone, like they have these different position. I guess maybe like they really feel like different parts of the body and different parts of the body that you might move from to express something. It feels like within that instrument there is a lot of potential, and because it literally comes from the control of the breath. Yeah, I mean, I don't play it. I wanted to play the saxophone when I was, I think, in primary school, and I got told I was too small, or that I wouldn't be able to like do it, which I guess was probably just sexism and maybe also racism at the time. Who knows? But I got told to do the clarinet instead, which was not as fun, and it was not the same thing. And so yeah, I squeaked through that for a few years. But other than that, I haven't really played myself. So I wonder, as this sort of like project evolves and I start working with people in a brass orchestra and talking about their position and how they experience it, I wonder if these sort of like metaphors that I attribute are something that are felt.
Hold on to the teeth, otherwise you'll fall out. Hold on, hold on. Kneel on the gums, a raucous seat, and look out at the show. We are a choir that sing so the living, the dead, and the lost can pass each other. Our songs form a porous passage that transports but never holds.
The figure that brought us to this bumpy place left us here and kept walking the perimeter searching for clouds, supposedly bringing us back our dreams. We haven't seen the figure since, clearing the road of rocks, clearing your way back to us.
I'm part of a people that have always sung the morning song. Our voices have flown by the choir inside, in swooping murmurations. Then I was dying, and we made chorus with the wind that would whirl me away.
At times, I feel like the stuff of the departed, inside a frustrated ball smashing into walls, then unravelling in a slump, missing the voice of touch.
I revise the moment I'm told that someone else has left, until it seems exact, and live between free falling, forget, and on the edge of the next second.
one of the sentences from your text on the show says, "The continual and faithful audience to the performance of our own lives." And that really spoke to me, both in the sense of like the performance in front of the audience as this sort of like show and event, and then this kind of like this daily being with ourselves and being in relation to others. But then it also, I was like, why is this line sticking out to me so much? And for some reason, it really reminds me of this other line, which is in a kind of collective consciousness maybe, which is, "Like sands through the hourglass, so are the days of our lives." And that's from Days of Our Lives. Do you know the TV show?
Yeah.
And again, this might be like a bit of a spurious link, but for some reason, I was just like, I mean, I don't even know if I would have watched that show, but again, it would have been on, would have been on TV, and maybe even, I mean, this is going to be on the TV station, right? This our conversation, and just maybe some of these references are also about like, what is the noise? Like, what is the noise that is the material that is in our lives now? And what are the words and the images that are just part of the fabric of our embodied experiences? And the fact that I mean, the two lines aren't exactly the same, but they sort of have this resonance. And to me, like sands through the hourglass, so are the days of our lives. It's just like such a like brilliant line. Whoever wrote that in the writer's room must have been like, yes, that is it. And it has lived for decades. I mean, I think the show might still be on, right? It started in the 80s.
Yeah, I think it is.
And again, that being this thing which is like on 5 days a week for several decades, and is this sort of like dramatization of these, I mean, sometimes like quite unbelievable moments of our lives. But maybe I'm just straying off into camp again, but I don't know why there's that like constant loop.
Imagine a wheel on a round surface, spinning around and around, covering the whole surface of a sphere, dragging itself from point to point. We are everything and everyone that came before us is a performance of sorts, is a spinning wheel connecting three global points, three cosmologies that view the world as an interconnected entity. The Mayan cosmovision, Sufism, and Leibniz's idea of the monad. But what is a monad even? Let's start with color. In this religious ceremony / dance choreography / TED Talk, green is a very important color. In Guatemalan Mayan cosmovision, the color green is associated with nature, therefore power, therefore Mayan royalty. As in life itself, in this performance, everything corresponds to everything. Formally, These three entities, cosmovision, Sufism, and monads, are united through a structure of four elements that make up each one of the entities, which brings us to the Mayan cross, also known as the round cross, or the sun cross. It is a cross whose four ends are connected by a circle. For the German philosopher Gottfried Leibniz, every monad is a universe in itself. Monads are the building blocks of reality. They can be basic monad, plants, soul monad, animal, spirit monad, person, supreme monad, God. Know yourself and you shall know your Lord, says an Islamic hadith. In Sufism, the more spiritual branch of Islam, there are four stages of practice and understanding. These are Shariat Rika, Hakika, and Marifa. And these stages are mirrored in the Mayan cosmovision. The Mayan cross, via the four cardinal points: south, the infloor world; east, gods of the rain; west, place of death; north, breathing. It's in these 4 points where spirituality, breathing, and health meet. It is in the movement of prayer that we can stimulate the parasympathetic nervous system along the vagus nerve. It's this stimulation that can lead to physical and mental health. Just like performance, it is all about the breath and the body. It is about the breathing. About breathing with the whole body.
I mean, maybe just broadening out a bit, it just sort of reminds me also a little bit about often the function of culture is as a kind of reflective tool that allows us to kind of sort of mirror our own experiences through these various cultural manifestations. And I think there's a very particular thing about kind of soap opera and the serial drama, you know, and the nature of that I think is really interesting, I think, as a materialization of time. And yeah, I mean, it's super camp and sort of like the kind of like artifice and engineering of that kind of sort of, you know, that drama. But you know, I'm also aware that like a lot of these shows are really important in relation to like social issues or you know, whether that's things like, you know, domestic violence or you know, queer rights, you know, often sort of kisses.
Anna Friel.
Yeah, exactly. I always remember that. You know, yeah. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I find that a very kind of, again, a very sort of generative. And then there's also this one other thing as well, which is facilitating a kind of collective experience. So in the way that we both remember that Anna Friel kind of like, you know, lesbian kiss, Channel 4, that's really, I think that as a kind of function of bringing people together in terms of like these collective cultural moments that really happen within popular culture, and examples of kind of popular culture. I can sort of reel off a whole other list of those.
And they probably also won't happen again. Like that was also, I guess, yeah, it definitely speaks to this sort of like idea of the loop that is part of the show, and maybe the fact that there are only very few stories, that the stories get retold, that there's, you know, I don't know, love interests, death of friends and family, there's work, there's loss of work, there's, I don't know, that there are these like very few stories that get told, and they're told in different ways. And when they're told on serials, that they're told again and again, like however many weddings, deaths, whatever that there are each time. But that also there is something that shifts, like that will never happen again, because there will never be 4 channels again, and we will never be sat watching TVs in real time again. And we probably don't live in the same collective ways exactly anymore. And so it probably will not be felt. Like we didn't have mobile phones then. So well, most of us didn't. You definitely couldn't watch anything on them. So it's like there will never be that exact experience of this real, what felt like a UK-wide at least collective memory. And so like the ways that, so there are these loops that sort of stay the same about our embodiment and our sort of like lives as humans roaming, but like that there are these shifts along the way. And I guess when I was thinking about like this question to you of like, does the loop degrade? I was sort of interested in that, like both, does it degrade and does it like almost snowball? Like or does it do both potentially? Like, so it kind of like, yeah, there's a repetition, but is there also something that shifts? And yeah, that was mine.
I think it's a really great question. Does the loop degrade? And I'm sort of really trying to kind of unpack that for myself. And I you know, I mean, an obvious answer is maybe that it's contextual in terms of depends on what constitutes the loop. But I mean, I guess I was trying to think about it in relation to sort of like manifestations of sort of like memory and history. And in some senses, the sort of material artifacts, the kind of sort of loop of them don't. They're kind of, they're there, you know, there are kind of like those references, those sources are kind of there. I think what degrades is the nature of our encounter with them. Like almost thinking about it like a kind of sort of planetary orbit, you know, where like there's kind of like a constant, but like there are these moments where there's a kind of, you know, a sort of intersection or crossover with that kind of
conjuncture, that way, like,
and then
yeah,
move away and then you come back to it. So it in that sense they're there, but it's the nature of our encounter with it, you know. And that for me is part of the thing about the forgetting and remembering, I kind of return to things. So there's a sense in which, like, I think about, like, you know, I mean, yeah, when you talk about a sort of Weimar, you know, Germany and this context of sort of kind of cabaret, I mean, it's so evocatively brought to life in that film, and Krista Isherwood's writing and stuff. But like, you know, I feel like, you know, a lot of that is also kind of forgotten. The literature is there. There is the kind of documentary kind of sources and evidence that's there. But it's often, but I'm sort of always interested in that moment of kind of forgetting and then the return back to that, you know, and that's often, I feel like, with like current affairs or politics, it's often, you know, with BLM, it's just kind of like that was just a moment of, for some people, of returning to something that they had maybe forgotten, that, you know, but for other people was just always there. And in a sense, that was just the nature of some people's kind of orbit, but for others, that, you know, you were just sort of spinning on that on that kind of axis of time constantly. So maybe I'm going to cut the space metaphors, because I'm sort of like my like astronomy knowledge of astronomy is sort of slowly running out. But I think it's a really, what I really love about that question is the provocation of the loop degrading, and the sort of challenge to the notion that it is, you know, it's a sort of just beautiful kind of static, clean, kind of circular. Yeah, I love that sense that there are kind of, the cycles are maybe different or elliptical, or, you know, yeah. So, what is the essence of performance? Essence is a weird word. I don't know why I use that word, but not a question that we want to focus on, certainly in this program, or perhaps even in the forthcoming exhibition. But it does allow us to speculate that the materiality of performance is its relationship with two audiences. Can you have a performance without an audience? Maybe, sadly, the continual and faithful audience to the performance of our own lives, perpetual spectators to our own performance.
I guess I was wondering if there has been a shift for you in this sort of year that we've been planning the show, in sort of like your relationship to the show and your own practice, and specifically to performance in your practice as well.
So yeah, I've been sort of really thinking a little bit more about you know, where ideas come from, what are particular kind of references or kind of engagements. And I think particularly around my sort of own performance practice, which is interesting because it's sort of like, you know, I started very much doing performance to camera, and that was this kind of just like, you know, in this space of like very much just setting up something on my own, recording, doing these actions very sort of simply. And then over the years, it's evolved very much more into kind of like live contexts. And, you know, being in that space of kind of live audiences. And then so it feels like with this sort of, these kind of moments of kind of lockdown, but in some ways I've returned back to this performing to the camera, but also with this added element of liveness, in that there's a kind of like, you know, through a platform like kind of Zoom or, you know, essentially speaking to a camera, but then linked into these other bodies operating in their different space. So it's forced me to think a little bit really about my own sort of performance histories, and really thinking about the dynamics of these new spaces that are being occupied. So I've been quite grateful for like having to do teaching, because I've had to conjure up like these performance workshops, but like to be delivered like on Zoom or like Teams or something, you know, on different platforms. And it's meant that I've sort of had to force myself to sort of negotiate it through practice. Like, okay, what, and so that, I think that for me has been a sort of saving, salient experience. And I think a lot of that has fed into then the thinking and conversations around, you know, Loop as an exhibition that's thinking about performance and embodiment in relation to structures of time and technology, and thinking about the intersection of these things, and that sort of binary that, you know, that would come with kind of like liveness, you know, the proximity to another body in the same space, how that has become really, at this moment, is really transgressive. Like, you know, it's weird because it's kind of like, I felt like, you know, like live, like performance art, you know, the sort of traditional, like what we think of as performance art, you know, like Marina or people like that getting naked and running around, that was sort of like a bit tired and a bit like, oh, just cliched, or like, you know, like, could often see people just glazing over at the thought of like some performance artist running around doing something durational or bodily or something, because it was seen to be in a way so like cliched and hackneyed. Whereas it's really, so one of the things I've been thinking about is actually that work now is like, whoa.
Yeah.
Oh, the kind of currency of that work. I mean, that's not to say that there'll be a return to that way of working. I don't necessarily think there will be, but it was just a way really of thinking about, and I think for me, this Loop show is a way of sort of really thinking through what are the current dynamics of, you know, this idea of performance, the body, embodiment, history, time, technology, even the space of the gallery, how does an audience encounter work, and what are the conditions that come about from those kind of encounters.
So we are Keiken.
My name's Tani.
My name's Hannah.
And we're going to present you our project Beta Bodies, or Better Bodies, which we're working on in collaboration with Studio Above and Below and Ethic Lab.
So what we are creating is a wearable silicone device to plug in additional senses beyond our existing felt, so beyond our individual perception. And it takes the shape of a wearable silicone womb. I know this might not make that much sense now, but we'll go through it. Hopefully you'll understand as we go along.
we're basically hoping to create a really immersive and visceral experience.
So the idea was born from this performance that we did in 2017 called Silicone Animism. And I'm not sure if you know what animism means, but animism is the belief that an objects, places, and creatures all possess a distinct spiritual essence. And the idea is that it almost has this kind of, not soul, but it's almost like, it's like a living entity. You can believe that an object or a place feels real to you and you believe that it exists.
And it has an essence, or even maybe not a personality as such, but it has an impact in the kind of like the way you experience the world in front of you and how you interact with it as well. It has an energy, I guess.
It's real and alive.
So one thing that we kind of really were very like interested in with this performance is that we worked with people, a diverse group of people, and everybody was wearing these silicone pregnancy bellies, these silicone wombs. And we realized after several days of doing this performance with different people was that it really didn't matter what sex, what age, or what gender you are. Everyone was able to feel this like instinct maternal attachment to the stomach, or to this like silicone womb.
It was actually kind of very hard for the performer to differentiate it as not being real in some ways. Like I remember the curator, he asked to wear it, he kind of ran off for 2 hours just intimately spending time with this womb. And then we had another performer, an ongoing collaborator, who it just triggered her to almost like expel an energy. Kind of, she was crying the whole day, and it reminded her of, she said that it reminded her of the beginning of herself and all those feelings attached to it. So we kind of just recognized this, that the womb was not, this silicone womb was a vessel, and like an emotional vessel in some way.
So it really got us thinking about Ursula Le Guin's Carrier Bag Theory of Fiction, a short essay, which she's basically redefining technology. And she argues that the first tool wasn't a spear, a weapon of violence or competition, or something that has a very kind of negative connotation to it, but it was actually a vessel, a carrier bag, gather seeds and nuts and nurture and bring energy, basically. She has this really nice quote that says, "Before the tool that forces energy outward, we made the tool that brings energy home." And we really started thinking about the womb as being another first technology, or really the first technology. It's a vessel in which you carry a baby for 9 months, and the baby is nurtured inside of you. We were thinking about how we can imagine the womb or the stomach as a carrier bag or vessel in which we can actually implant different perspectives, which are maybe not human, which are maybe more animalistic or even non-human entirely. And through the HAT technology, we can translate that information into something that's palpable for the wearer.
Mm-hmm. We kind of then started to look at Jaak Panksepp. His theories have been something that we constantly look back in throughout all of our work, and he coined the word affective neuroscience. So just to backtrack, Jaak Panksepp is an Estonian neuroscientist and psychobiologist. And the affective neuroscience is the name for the field that studies the neuromechanisms of emotions. And what's unique about Jaak Panksepp is that he studied the emotions of humans through other animals. So all his research was looking at the emotions of animals and trying to understand the emotions of animals and then relating that back to humans. As we share both the reptilian and the limbic brain with most animals. So our brain structures in many ways are very similar to animals. It's more the neocortex that is the part that's very different to other animals. So there's a really nice quote from him that he said was, "If we begin to understand the emotions of other animals, I think we'll begin to understand our own emotions." And so from here, we started to look at how we could do this. How could we create this technology as like an empathy tool? How can we understand the emotions of other animals if we share actual brain structures that are very similar to them? Like, there must be a way, and is this vessel, this carrier bag, could this be the way that we can unlock this? So then we started to look at Paul Baki-Rita, who is a Mexican neuroscientist, and he figured out the study of sensory substitution. So we'll just show you a video on this now.
We don't see with the eyes, for example. We don't hear with the ears. All of that goes on in the brain. Remember, if I'm looking at you, the image of you doesn't get beyond my retina, just the back of my eye. From there to the brain, to the rest of the brain, it's pulses along nerves. Well, those pulses aren't any different than the pulses from the big toe. It's the way the information they carry is in the frequency and the pattern of pulses. And so if you can train the brain to extract that kind of information, then you don't need the eye to see. You can have an artificial eye.
So what Paul Baki-Rita discovered was sensory substitution. And what essentially that is that he realized that you could substitute one sense that maybe you no longer have for another sense. So in his famous case study was, he had a patient who was blind, and he basically put some sensors, this sensory technology, onto his tongue, and that was connected to 3 cameras, and basically the camera acted as the eye for the patient, and every time the camera moved around and looked where he would essentially be looking if he could see, it basically translated it into sensory image. So it would basically make the image kind of similar to how you draw on somebody's back or something when you try to like say, like, guess what I'm drawing. And slowly the patient would learn what was being visualized. And because how it works is that the retina is only it's basically just it's like a device, but how it works is it's not the eye that makes you see, it's like the nerves and the pulse and the sensation that gets to the eye. So what he discovered was that you could almost like retrain the brain to see with a different device. So the camera became the eye, and the blind person actually began to see. So it's not just like the blind person just feels it and translates it. He starts to pick up the image. So the patient, he started to pick up the actual image of what was around him.
This really opens up the possibilities of how we can actually experience the world in front of us and what's around us. He really proved, I mean, he was one of the most groundbreaking neuroscientists in kind of pushing this idea of neuroplasticity. Because in the past, neuroscientists sort of believed that, or it was a previous misconception, that the brain kind of stopped developing and changing and growing after childhood, and almost that it was as a piece of hardware, it was just fixed at that point. But alongside other recent advances and kind of Paul Baki-Rita's experiments, they were proving that this isn't true. The brain really can and does change throughout our lives, and it has this plasticity in it. We can teach it or we don't even need to teach it anything. We can just allow it to process inputted information or data, and it will figure out what to do with that new information.
And then you train it basically to be able to read it. So through training and learning, you then be able to have like almost like a new way of perceiving that you was not biologically there previously. So then we looked at David Eagleman, so unfortunately Paul Baki-Rita passed away a while ago. I'm not really sure when, but so David Eagleman took his research and then started to like add on to that, and he decided to look at if we can have sensory substitution, then surely we can have sensory addition. So that is the idea, that rather than replacing a sense with another sense that is missing, what about if you can create a new sense and rewire the brain to have a new sense, which kind of aligns a lot to what we've been looking at. Is this possible? Is it possible to implant a new way of perceiving through rewiring or retraining the brain to express it through senses? So what David Eagleman looked into was looking at our Umwelt. So our Umwelt in ethology is the world as it is experienced by a particular organism. And so what we can see is less than a 10 trillionth of what is out there. So our objective reality isn't actually objective reality. It is our objective reality within the confinement of our particular organism that we exist in. How can we use technology to add a completely new kind of sense to expand the human Umwelt? So how can we see beyond what we individually perceive? So what we've been kind of looking into first is, can humans develop an experience of an animal? Can it connect emotionally to an animal or feel something that in the way that an animal could feel, using this kind of theory? So David Eagleman created the PH model, which stands for potato head model, which is kind of like a bit of a joke that you can replace the mouth where the ears are, the nose where the lips are, and it's essentially, we have these biological receptors, your nose, your mouth, and you can rewire it, plug and play it into a different part of your body, or add maybe a new sense. Maybe, Tan, you can have a pig nose. Maybe
I've always wanted.
Okay, so I'm gonna tell you a quote from David Eagleman, as he explains it much better than I do. So, the brain doesn't know or care what the data comes from. It just figures out what to do with it and does it efficiently. Eagleman calls this the PH model of evolution. I use the name to emphasize that all these senses that we know and love, like our eyes, our ears, and fingertips, these are merely peripheral plug and play devices. You stick them in and you're good to go. The brain figures out what to do with the data that comes in. Our brain isn't hardware or software, it is liveware. As it is always changing, it's constantly reconfiguring itself to optimize its function in the world. You are changing the hardware at all points.
I guess it's about recognizing how the structures that we exist in are actually a lot more fluid than we imagine them to be. So in creating this technology, which is to expand our Umwelt, or kind of expand our experience beyond our perception of being human, it's really about using the tools that are available to us, which are maybe just we haven't really tapped into yet.
And so we can show you now some of the little tests we have been doing with this. We've not yet made the final piece, but we've been experimenting with the haptic technology. And in the videos you're about to see, we have been inputting the sounds of different animals and the communication of different animals into transferring it into sensory data.
So we've been gathering the sounds of animals which use ultrasound to communicate, and those recordings, or the translations of those recordings, are going to be what the wearer of the wearable will be able to feel, not just hear, feel as well.
So far we've really just got to the point where we are driving the experience and really understanding how it feels and whether we can feel something through that experience. And it's been really interesting because what we have noticed is that each animal's sounds really create a completely different feeling. So for example, the sounds of dolphins really creates this very like underwater kind of motion, where it feels like the senses are not right next to you, they feel like they're like all around you. Whereas like the sounds of the rats, they really feel like they're coming from the center of your belly. And it's just kind of, yeah, we're just kind of in the process of like understanding whether we feel connected to this and how it feels. At the moment, it feels very, it's actually a very relaxing experience. It's very, so it's somewhat like emotional too, I'd say. Like,
so yeah, we're really in the early stages of developing and prototyping this technology, and also just doing the research to understand the different connections between neuroscience and the physical hardware, and also just the human experience. So we just hope this gives you a bit of an insight into our project. And thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening.
I feel like that's been helpful in general in terms of thinking about the purpose of sort of like making work being less about sort of like coming up with a solution, or even just like that. I mean, more so than ever, I felt that the making of the work and the flow and the conversations that come through it and the pacing of it and the timing are all part of whatever ends up being the more final form. And actually sort of like becoming like accountable to that, or like friends with that or something, and not trying to resist it so much. And I guess that also being a very sort of important but somewhat small way of like resisting and sort of decolonizing a little bit, in terms of actually just saying the work's not ready, I don't know yet, or it's not, you know, I don't know the things I'm going to know, but I know that through this process some sort of there will be sort of like some realizations along the way, which is like a very anti-institutional position to have, really, because the institution has deadlines, and the time, I mean, I guess we were maybe going to have the show last summer, and that just seems completely unreasonable and unrealistic at this point, like in terms of like how long it takes to gestate and realize what a work might be, and what a relationship is, and what is to be found out in a process.
Of like flux. It's kind of, we think it's going to be here, but it might not be. It might be kind of like,
yeah, and that's an anxious space to be in. It's not necessarily that's like calm, or even that the people who are kind of like supplying the resources have the ability or kind of like foresight to be able to actually hold that flux. I guess this is the other thing. So there is the flux that we always knew existed, and now there is this sort of like realization of the fact that it does exist by many people who are involved. But then it's like, okay, well then how do you actually hold that and resource it properly and support it properly? And I guess those are some of probably the next questions. Yeah. Yeah, I haven't even said lugubrious once.
We need to talk about that. That would be good, actually. That was because it's just such a evocative word, and I think also when you were talking about it in relation to sort of camp, yeah, I was sort of just really interested in the kind of like synergies or connections between like the like the idea of the lugubrious and an idea of kind of camp.
Yeah, no, I realized we sort of like went somehow down this lane of like basically sort of just me listing all of these different historic atrocities, and that sort of like wasn't really where we went in our last conversation. And when we were talking about, I guess, camp and the lugubrious, it was much more kind of in the present in a way. But yeah, this word lugubrious, I feel like is one that like came up a lot because of its nature as something that is performed, and that it is a literal performance of mourning. And I remember when I was first reading about like the etymology of the word and instances of its sort of like embodiment, one of the references given was that I think in the sort of like Victorian era England, you would have someone who would be at the sort of, it's not the pallbearer, that's in church, it's like the person who would be at the front of the death march would be paid specifically because they were like someone who could express who they were lugubrious people, and they would express affected mourning. They would look especially sad and drawn, and that there was part of like processing the death, and I guess mostly it would have been of someone of wealth or importance in those situations, would be to have this person who sort of led the miserable, led in this kind of deeply mournful way.
I'm not sure if you just we want to leave it there, or
sure.
And like,
we could just leave it there.
Hi, my name is Harold Offeh, and you're watching Loop TV.